Good evening, Dungeon Masters. I'm Baron Darab. Gary Gygax's world building is foundational to the D&D hobby. From the legendary Tomb of Horrors to the Village of Hamlet, or even D&D's most iconic non-dragon monster, the Beholder, all got their start in this Greyhawk setting. Today, we're doing a geopolitical breakdown of Greyhawk's continent, Flanness. Remember, geopolitics is the study of how geography influences culture and society. Dissecting Greyhawk's geography in this way will help us understand how the various population centers in Gary Gygax's world building would leverage the continent to their advantage and understand why these populations would perennially come into conflict. A nation in its most basic form needs three things to be secure: wide expanses of land to raise crops and build cities, rivers to irrigate that farmland and connect the cities through waterborne trade, and terrain like mountains or oceans that make defending all these rivers, farms, and cities easy. And if there's one thing we can say about Flanness, it has all of this stuff in spades. To dissect Gygax's world building, we can highlight where each river system would enable a different culture or nationality to coalesce, and outline where the geography makes these river systems easily defendable. These outlined areas are the possible contenders for Greyhawk superpowers, or at least its regional hegemons. The two river systems in the Sheldomar Valley contain all the geographical diversity a large population needs to become wealthy and secure. Timber from the forests, metal ores from the mountains, clay from the riverbank hills, there's even ample farmland for irrigation and agriculture. Additionally, these rivers are close enough to one another that the various population centers which pop up along their coasts would be able to conduct overland trade easily. While using roads instead of rivers to conduct trade can cost 20 times more than its waterborne equivalent, trade of expensive value-added products still would make sense over land for these short distances. Therefore, while these distinct cultures might start as rival tribes, it would only be a matter of time before they would coalesce into one national identity. This is further enabled by the proximal river mouths. A quick jaunt down the coastline is all that's needed for merchants to trade on both river systems. A great example of this happening in Earth's history is the nation of France. What started during the fall of the Roman Empire as a series of bickering European tribes would eventually coalesce into one of the most long-lived and most stable nations on the planet. Charles the Bald laid the groundwork for a holistic French identity along the Seine, Loire, and Garonne river systems, all while those populations were geographically protected by the Atlantic and English Channel, as well as the Vosges, Jura, Alpine, and Pyrenees mountains. France's geography is so protective and stable, the only French regime change occurred 1,000 years after the nation's founding. This regime change only occurred because a poverty-stricken populist uprising couldn't decide if it wanted to be ruled by a monarch, a despot, or a republic. Like France's northern plain route, however, Sheldomar has regions requiring defense to ensure its long-term stability. The Sheldomar Valley's northern gap between the Lortmill, Yatil, and Barrier Peak mountains contains Bessel, who will always need to be alert of foreign invasion. However, more threatening is the southern gap. Housing the Wild Coast and Pomarge Hills, this gap's population is even more threatening because it also has its own river system, and therefore food security. Importantly though, this river exists on the outside of the Lortmill Mountains. Unfortunately, this Sheldomar Valley geographic exclusion makes this region much more susceptible to invasion from elsewhere. Therefore, depending on Sheldomar's internal politics, the Sheldomar people would constantly flip-flop their perception of the Pomarge and Wild Coast. Since this mountain gap is so important to Sheldomar security, the politique de jour might celebrate the Wild Coast and Pomarge people as valiant warriors who provide the valley with strategic depth, or, if they would refuse to provide that depth, as nationalist militants with too many threatening ideas. Old Aerdi is nearly as defensible as the Sheldomar Valley thanks to the Glorial and Raker Mountains and Salanis Ocean, Aerdi Sea, and Relmore Bay. Similarly, the region has large river systems to support various metropolitan communities. But there is one key difference. The distance between the mouths of these rivers and their respective port towns would cause each river's culture to constantly challenge the other's lack of security. Therefore, cyclical power struggles would would constantly ebb and flow across the region. A similar geographical condition exists on the Chinese mainland as well. The Yellow, Yangtze, and Pearl rivers all dump into their own bodies of water, the Yellow, East, and South China Seas respectively. This geography has contributed to China's long-term social instability, where on average, a Chinese hegemon only survives for about 200 years before the whole thing falls into 50 years of upheaval. Infighting is so common on the Chinese plain, the names of these historical periods are exemplary of the struggles. Names include the 5 Kingdoms 10 Dynasties period or the 3 Kingdoms period don't indicate a sense of constant national unity. As a contrast to France's stability, China has had no less than 10 regime changes since the concept of Frankish nationality emerged over a millennia ago. To turn back then to Old Aerdi, the 2 regional powers would be the See of Medegia and the Prelacy of Almor. The Great Kingdom might be great in name, but it would constantly be caught as a monkey in the middle between the 2 other civilizations, and due to its landlocked nature, unable to reach deep water ports for trade. Additionally, the North Province would likely be perceived by the other nations as an unmanageable and untrustworthy state. While the North Province would seldom be powerful enough to challenge Almor or Medegia outright, it always would have the ability to tip the scales of continental power as it flip-flops its alliance from one regional nation to the other. To zoom out for a moment, one of the most subtly influential cultures on this region would be the city of Akul on the Tilvanot Peninsula. Pirates, privateers, or patrols from Akul might force Sheldomar merchant decision-making when concerning international trade. To iterate, the Sea of Medegia has a larger river system, and therefore a larger population, and larger markets. But if the Tilvanot Peninsula's people become a fly in the mercantile ointment, Sheldomar's trade would likely shift to the more secure, albeit smaller, Prelacy of Almor. What's interesting, though, is that as the Tilva Strait trade route becomes less and less utilized, so too would the rate of piracy decrease, as well as the danger of the route. Over time, trade patterns from Sheldomar would flop back and forth between these 2 civilizations as Akul's power projection ability also ebbs and flows. To further discuss an interesting detail about the Tilvanot Peninsula, it's a shame the river system doesn't flow into the Tilva Strait. If it did, what likely is little more than a remote pirate backwater would become a powerful city-state. Singapore, sitting at the mouth of the Johor River, for example, dominates the Strait of Malacca, connecting East Asia with the rest of the world. Because of this geographical position, Singapore gets to play Mother May I with roughly 30% of all international trade. Unfortunately for Akul, the city doesn't have this geography to rise to that level of dominance. If you thought Old Aerdi was tumultuous, the river systems of the Nyr Dyv Basin are as varied as they are insecure. In fact, the various rivers are the only thing that provide any strategic security at all, not agriculture security. Whenever you see open land so full of adjacent rivers, cultures typically don't invest in agriculture. They instead focus on herding. These herders develop their culture on the plains instead of the rivers and compete over the best grazing lands and hunting grounds. Even so, when a brutal warlord rises to stop the infighting, a region like this can quickly come under one national identity. A solid example of this are the various historical tribes that lived among the American Midwest. Dozens of tribes lived between each river that flowed into the Mississippi River, but when the brutal Comanche rose to prominence, their genocidal warfare all but eliminated the Apache, Pawnee, Osage, Blackfeet, Kiowa, and Tonkawa tribes. The Comanche even prevented French and Spanish expansion into the Midwest. The pop culture who would win showdown hypotheticals between the Comanche and Golden Horde Mongols is fitting from a geopolitical comparison as well. The Asian steppes are always under constant infighting until some warlord could direct their aggression elsewhere. Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, and the Scythian king Erdanthissus, among others, all invaded on regular intervals due to these cults of personality. In Nyr Dyv, therefore, I'd expect the Prelacy of Almor and Bissell to catch the brunt of similar horse rider incursions. Obviously, Gary Gygax's Greyhawk is extremely complex and rife with geopolitical depth. If you'd like to help me make more content like this in the future, please consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member. Thanks for watching, Dungeon Masters, and until next time, good night.